Have you ever wondered what it would be like to wake up in the middle of winter and find something massive, mysterious, and entirely unexpected standing outside your home? Tonight, I'm going to take you on a story that's stranger than fiction, a story of courage, survival, and a creature that most people only whisper about. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, because you won't want to miss any part of this unbelievable journey. Stay with me until the very end. You're about to witness something that will change the way you think about the wilderness forever. This isn't just a story about the unknown. It's about trust, respect, and the extraordinary bond between humans and a species most of us have only dreamed of seeing. Let's begin. Have you ever woken up in the middle of winter to find 6 Bigfoot standing guard around your house, as if they're protecting you from something? Yeah, I didn't know that was even possible until it happened to me, but I'm getting ahead of myself. It all started back in mid-December when I was about 10 years old, living on a cattle ranch in northern Montana, close to the Canadian border. My dad had been running the farm by himself since my mom passed away 2 years prior. We had around 200 head of cattle, and the land stretched for thousands of acres, reaching all the way up to Canada. Most days it was just me, my dad, the cattle, and the heavy snow. But that winter was different. There was something off from the very beginning. The cattle kept getting spooked for no apparent reason. One minute they'd be grazing as usual, and the next, they'd scatter across the field as though something invisible was chasing them. My dad would go check, but there was never anything there. No wolves, no bears, nothing. Just massive footprints in the snow, too large to belong to any animal we knew. Then came the howls. Every night for 2 solid weeks, this low, guttural sound echoed through the forest. It wasn't like a wolf's or a coyote's call. It was deeper, stronger, almost as if it came from something with a chest as wide as a barrel. The noise would start around midnight and go on for hours. Sometimes it sounded close, other times it was far off. My dad would stand out on the porch with his rifle, staring into the woods, but he never shot. He just watched and listened. He kept finding huge footprints near the tree line where the forest met our property. I'm talking about tracks nearly 45 centimeters long, maybe even longer. They looked human, but off too wide, with claw marks at the tips. My dad insisted they were bear tracks, maybe from a grizzly wandering down from Canada. He'd always brush the snow off them and tell me not to worry, but I could see the worry in his eyes. He was scared. One morning in early December, my dad went out to check the northern pasture and found the gate ripped right off its hinges. Not just swung open or broken, but ripped out of the metal posts, like someone had grabbed it with their bare hands and yanked hard. The posts were bent at odd angles, and the gate was lying about 30 feet away in the snow. My dad didn't say much when he came back inside. I had just called the town to order some supplies when my dad left that morning. Before he left, he gave me strict instructions. Stay inside, lock the doors, and don't go outside to check anything. He'd be back in a few hours. It was about an hour's drive to town, so I knew I'd be alone for a while. I said, "Okay, no problem." But I knew I'd get bored and wander around anyway. My dad's truck faded down the long dirt road, and I was left all alone. The house was so quiet. I did the chores, fed the dogs, and made myself lunch. By early afternoon, I started getting restless. I kept looking out the window toward the pasture where we kept about 40 cattle separated from the main herd. From inside, everything seemed fine, but I figured I should check it out. Just a quick walk, that's all. What could go wrong, right? I grabbed my heavy jacket, laced up my boots, and headed outside. The snow was falling steadily, big, soft flakes making everything look quiet and peaceful. I walked toward the pasture, following the fence line. That's when I noticed the snow looked disturbed, as though something large had just passed through. Fence posts were knocked down in several places, and the wire was bent. I should have turned back right then, but I was 10, curious, and foolish, so I kept following the trail. The thick snow led me off the pasture and into the woods. I figured maybe one of the cattle had wandered off, and I'd find it before my dad came back. So I kept going. About a mile into the woods, the trees thickened, and the snow grew deeper. My legs were aching as I pushed through the heavy drifts. That's when I heard a low, painful sound echoing through the trees. It wasn't exactly a moan, and it wasn't a growl. It was something in between, something that sounded like suffering. I followed the sound to a clearing I'd never seen before. Someone had been there recently. There were tire tracks in the snow, but they looked a few days old, judging by how much snow had accumulated over them. In the middle of the clearing was a massive metal cage, about 10 feet high and 8 feet wide. The kind of cage used to transport dangerous animals. Only this one wasn't going anywhere. It was just sitting there in the snow. Inside the cage was a Bigfoot. I know how that sounds. Believe me, I didn't want to believe it either. But there's no other way to describe what I was looking at. The creature was huge, about 8 feet tall, even sitting down, covered in dark, reddish-brown fur. It was coated in frost and snow. The Bigfoot was huddled in the corner of the cage, shivering. One of its legs was caught in a heavy steel trap, the kind used by poachers to catch bears. Blood had congealed around the trap where it had bitten into its leg. The Bigfoot looked up as I approached, and that's when I saw its face. I expected it to look terrifying or ferocious, but it didn't. The Bigfoot looked utterly exhausted, cold, and in pain. Its gaze met mine, and there was something in its eyes that felt almost human, not quite, but close enough to make my chest tighten. Around the cage, the remnants of a makeshift camp were scattered. Someone had left a generator, now silent. A propane heater lay tipped over in the snow, useless. Empty food boxes and cigarette filters were strewn about, half buried in snow. Whoever had been here had clearly fled in a hurry, never to return. The Bigfoot let out that low, guttural sound again, this time quieter. It wasn't trying to scare me or threaten me. It was just cold, hurt, and probably thinking that no one would come to help. I stood there for what felt like 20 minutes, trying to figure out what to do. My dad was in town and wouldn't be back for at least another hour, maybe longer if the roads were bad. This Bigfoot couldn't survive long out in the cold. I could see frost clinging to its fur, and the way it shivered was worsening. I knew the safest, wisest choice would be to leave. But looking at the creature, suffering and trapped, I couldn't walk away. I had to do something. Slowly, I circled the cage, keeping my distance at first. The Bigfoot watched me, but it didn't move. The cage door was at the far end, secured with a heavy chain and padlock. I tried it once, twice. There was no way I could break it without tools. That's when I remembered the abandoned camp. I dug through the scattered debris, sifting through snow, and under a tarp, I found a pair of bolt cutters. They had probably been left behind when whoever had set this trap ran off. Cold and heavy in my hands, they still worked. I carried the bolt cutters to the cage. The Bigfoot's eyes followed me the entire way. I set the cutters on the chain and began to work. It took forever. My fingers were numb, even with gloves, and my arms shook from the effort. The chain was thick, the cutters sturdy, but I kept at it, squeezing, repositioning, squeezing again. The creature just sat there, watching. It didn't try to grab me through the bars or make a threatening sound. It just panted, frost puffing from its mouth in large clouds. After what felt like 20 minutes of struggle, the chain finally snapped with a loud crack that echoed across the clearing. I yanked the broken chain free of the padlock and pulled hard at the door. It swung open on rusty hinges. I stepped back, way back. I had no idea what this creature would do once free. Would it attack me? I was alone in the forest with something that could tear me apart without trying, but it didn't move aggressively. The Bigfoot just sat, staring at the open door as if it couldn't believe what had happened. I waved toward the opening, signaling it could leave. Nothing. Then, slowly, so painfully slow, it began to move. It crawled forward on hands and knees, dragging the trapped leg behind it. Soft, pained groans escaped its throat with every movement. The sound was one of sheer effort and extreme agony. When it finally got out of the cage, it collapsed in the snow just a few steps from the door. I panicked. Freeing it should have solved the problem, but it was too weak to stand. The Bigfoot lay in the snow, its sides rising and falling, frost coating its fur. I realized it needed more help than just an open door. I ran back to the abandoned camp and grabbed a tarp that was still in decent shape. I also hauled the propane heater. Heavy as it was, I managed to drag both to where the Bigfoot had fallen. It took a few tries to get the heater started. My frozen fingers fumbled with the controls, but finally, warmth radiated from it. I draped the tarp over the Bigfoot's upper body, trying to trap some heat. It looked at me with intelligent eyes, but it didn't resist. Up close like this, I could see the injuries were worse than I'd realized. Frost had clung to its fur in several places, and it was badly battered. Bigfoot's breathing was weak and uneven. That's when I noticed the steel trap was still clamped onto its leg. The jaws had bitten deep, and I could see both fresh and congealed blood around the metal. I knew I had to remove it. I grabbed a thick stick and slowly approached. Bigfoot's eyes tracked every move I made. I gestured first to the trap, then to the stick, trying to communicate what I was about to do. I didn't know if it understood, but when I knelt beside the trapped leg, it didn't pull away. The trap had a release mechanism, but it had frozen solid. I slid the stick under the jaws and began to pry. The creature let out a small, deep noise from its chest, but stayed perfectly still. It seemed to understand that I was trying to help, even though it was in agony. After what felt like an eternity, the spring finally gave, and the jaws snapped open. Immediately, Bigfoot pulled its trapped leg free. Now, I could see the wound clearly. Deep punctures, torn flesh, and shredded skin. At least the trap was gone. Bigfoot looked at me for a long moment. Then it slowly extended one massive hand, careful, deliberate. I froze, unsure of what to expect. Its hand was enormous, maybe twice the size of mine, covered in coarse hair. It gently rested the palm on the top of my head just once, barely pressing. About 3 seconds later, it withdrew. I understood. That was its way of saying thanks, an acknowledgement of what I'd done. Slowly, Bigfoot rose to its full height. It was enormous, probably 8 feet tall, maybe taller. Standing there, frost and blood covering its massive form, it should have been terrifying, but I felt only relief that it could stand. The creature staggered a few steps toward the tree line, limping heavily on its injured leg. It paused at the edge of the clearing and glanced back at me one last time. Then it disappeared into the forest, moving between the trees with an almost eerie silence despite its wounded leg. Within seconds, it was gone, leaving only falling snow and endless forest behind. I stood there for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened, until I remembered my dad would be back soon and that I was supposed to be inside. I ran. By the time I reached the ranch, my lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly. I stripped off my wet outer layers in the mudroom and changed into dry clothes. I had been outside for hours. The sun was beginning to set. About 20 minutes later, my dad's truck rolled up. He stepped inside, carrying bags of supplies, and immediately asked where I had been. I lied. I told him I'd been playing around the barn, checking on equipment. He stared at me, as if he knew I wasn't telling the truth, but didn't press. That evening, during dinner, he mentioned hearing reports on the radio from town. Some hunters claimed their camps had been raided in the national forest. They said some animal had attacked them. Authorities assumed the hunters had been drunk and misfired their rifles, or maybe they had startled a bear. My dad recounted it like a joke, some ridiculous prank city folks tell themselves. I pushed food around my plate and said nothing. That night, lying in bed, I heard something outside. A faint rustling in the snow, rhythmic like footsteps, but heavier than a human's. I got up and looked out my bedroom window. At the edge of the yard, where the clearing met the forest, a huge figure stood in the falling snow. It was Bigfoot. I could barely make out details in the darkness. Just a towering, upright silhouette, but I knew it was the same Bigfoot I had freed. It stood there silently, watching the house. I pressed my hand against the cold window and raised it in greeting. Bigfoot lifted one massive hand in response. Then it turned and walked into the forest, vanishing among the trees. I thought it was over. I had helped it. It had thanked me. And now we would both continue our lives. Or so I thought. The next morning, I woke up and went outside to help my dad with chores. As we rounded the back of the house, a neatly stacked pile of firewood rested beside the back door. The logs were split and arranged far more neatly and in greater quantity than the wood my dad had chopped yesterday. He stood there, staring at the pile, counting and recounting, looking confused. He asked if I had moved any wood the day before. I said no, and he mumbled something about miscounting. We went on with the day's work. 2 days later, my dad discovered 3 rabbits hanging by the barn door. They had been cleaned and gutted, ready to cook. My dad called out to me, asking if any neighbors had stopped by. I told him I hadn't seen anyone. He looked around the property with a suspicious expression, but he couldn't figure out where the rabbits had come from. That's when I saw them, the tracks. Huge footprints pressed deep into the snow, running from the woods to the barn and back again. I followed them to the tree line, then quickly covered them with fresh snow before Dad could see. More things started to show up. A sack of wild mushrooms left on the porch. A perfectly scraped deer hide hanging from the fence. Bundles of pine branches stacked neatly near the shed. Every few days, something new appeared. My dad began to worry. He started carrying his rifle everywhere, even just walking from the house to the barn. At night, he'd stand on the porch staring out at the tree line, rifle in hand. I knew he suspected something, but he didn't know what. One morning, I woke up and found something scrawled into the frost on his truck window. It was crude, just lines and scratches, but I could see what it was, a stick figure standing next to a much larger figure. The small one was me. The big one was Bigfoot. My dad saw it too. At first, he didn't say anything, just stared at it for a long time. Then he came inside and told me to sit at the kitchen table. He asked me, very seriously, if I'd seen anything strange lately, anything at all. I couldn't lie anymore. I told him about the trip into the woods, about finding the cage, about the Bigfoot trapped inside. I didn't mention freeing it, just that I'd found it and come home. My dad stayed silent. He sat there a long time, not moving, thinking. Finally, he told me that a few days earlier some hunters had come through town asking questions about our land. They claimed their equipment had been stolen and their camp raided. They even hinted they had a right to hunt on our property, which was a lie. My dad had told them to leave. My stomach churned. It had to be those poachers who'd tracked Bigfoot in the first place. And now they knew someone had interfered with their operation. 3 days later, I was splitting wood near the barn when 2 trucks came crawling up our long driveway, kicking up snow. I yelled for Dad. 3 rough-looking men stepped out, dressed in deer hunting gear, rifles slung over their shoulders. I recognized the trucks from the tire tracks I'd seen in the forest. They were the ones who had trapped Bigfoot. My dad stepped out of the barn with his shotgun in hand. He told them to state their business or leave. They claimed they'd set up research equipment on our land, and someone had sabotaged it. They wanted to know what we knew. Dad told them straight. This was private property, and they had no right to be here, let alone install anything. The lead hunter, a big man with a heavy beard, got aggressive. He stepped closer to my dad and said they knew someone had ruined their project. Then he sneered, "Accidents happen on farms, especially to folks living out here alone with their kids." My dad raised the shotgun and aimed it squarely at the man's chest. His voice was calm when he ordered them to leave our property immediately. For a moment, I thought the man might do something stupid, but he backed off. As they climbed into their trucks, the bearded hunter shouted that we'd be seeing them again soon. Dad called the sheriff as soon as they were gone. The sheriff said the roads were buried in snow and it would take at least a day before anyone could get to the ranch. Dad hung up and immediately started boarding up some of the downstairs windows. He loaded every gun in the house and told me not to leave, no matter what I heard. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in bed listening to the wind whistle softly around the house. Dad was downstairs, moving from door to window, checking each one. Around midnight, I heard the sound of breaking glass. I jumped up and looked out the window just in time to catch the sweep of flashlights moving around the barn. The hunters were back. My dad was moving too. I heard him grab the rifle and head toward the back door. From the upstairs window, I watched. The 3 hunters were in the yard, between the house and the barn. They were yelling, trying to lure Dad out by threatening the livestock. Dad stepped out the back door, rifle in hand. I could see him facing the 3 men in the yard. All of them had guns. Their voices bounced through the cold night air as they argued. Dad told them to leave. The hunters claimed we had stolen from them and insisted they had full rights here. Then the lead hunter raised his rifle and pointed it at Dad. Before he could fire, something massive leapt from the shadows behind the shed. A Bigfoot moved with astonishing speed for its size, crashing through the snow toward the hunters. But it wasn't just one. Shadows appeared from multiple directions. 4 more Bigfoot surrounded the hunters. They started screaming, firing wildly into the darkness. The huge creatures didn't attack directly, but they moved like living barriers, cutting off escape routes, driving the men toward the center of the yard. One hunter tried to run toward the house. A Bigfoot stepped into his path and let out a roar. The sound was ear-shattering. rattling my chest even from the upstairs window. The glass trembled. The hunter dropped his rifle and fell backward into the snow. All three men were screaming, shooting in every direction. The Bigfoot moved around them in the shadows, too fast to track, sounds echoing from the barn to the treetops. Then, as quickly as it began, the hunters ran toward their trucks, but the Bigfoot had disabled the vehicles. Every tire was slashed to the rim. The hunters stood for a moment, staring at their destroyed trucks, then fled down the driveway into the darkness. Dad stood frozen in the yard, rifle still in hand. The Bigfoot stepped into the light from the porch. Now I could see them clearly. There were 6 in total. The one I had freed was easy to recognize, still limping on its injured leg. The others were roughly the same size, covered in dark fur. One was slightly smaller, probably female, and one was enormous, almost 9 feet tall, clearly the leader. They didn't move toward Dad or the house. They simply formed a protective perimeter around the property. 2 near the horse barn, 2 near the house entrance, 2 in the yard. Dad slowly retreated to the porch, calling my name. I ran down the stairs, pushing past him despite his protests. I stepped onto the porch. The Bigfoot I had freed stepped forward, still limping but clearly much stronger. It looked at me, then at Dad, and deliberately placed something on the porch steps. It was the padlock and chain from the cage, twisted and broken as if torn apart by hand. Dad looked at the chain, then at me. I saw the light dawn in his eyes. He finally understood. He understood what I had done in the woods that day. The Bigfoot were in position around the property. 2 by the barn, 2 near the entrance, 2 in the yard. They were just standing there, observing, protecting us. Dad and I went back inside. We watched from the windows all night. The Bigfoot didn't move. They stood guard like silent sentries in the snow, keeping watch over the driveway and the forest. They remained for 3 days and 3 nights. During the day, some rested while others stood watch. They rotated like soldiers, taking turns alert and resting. At night, all of them stayed awake, eyes reflecting any light that fell upon them, gleaming in the dark. On the 2nd day, a deputy finally managed to reach the ranch. The roads had been cleared enough for him to drive in. He saw the massive footprints in the snow, the destroyed trucks still sitting in the driveway with shredded tires, and he didn't know what to say. The deputy sheriff reported that the 3 hunters had been found walking along the highway about 20 miles away. They were frostbitten and sunburned. At the hospital, they claimed they had been attacked by a monster. No charges were filed. They just wanted to leave the state as fast as possible. The deputy looked around at the tracks, glanced at Dad, and said he'd make a report, but probably the best course was to keep quiet. Then he drove off, a horrified expression on his face. Meanwhile, I began leaving food out for the Bigfoot. Bread, vegetables, leftover meat from dinner. I set it on the porch steps, and by morning it was gone. The Bigfoot had carefully taken the offerings. The smaller one, the one I thought was female, even came up to the porch a few times to take food directly from my hand. Her hands were enormous, yet gentle as she picked up the bread. Dad watched from the window. He didn't stop me. I could see he was still wary, but he no longer carried a rifle. He was beginning to understand. The Bigfoot were not a threat. They had come to help. The injured Bigfoot, the one I had freed, began leaving gifts in return. More firewood appeared, stacked neatly. One morning, a fox pelt was draped over the porch railing. Smooth river stones were arranged into shapes on the steps. It was their way of saying thank you, maintaining balance between us. On the 3rd day, they brought something different. The hunters' rifles, the 3 of them, were utterly destroyed. Barrels bent at impossible angles, stock snapped in 2. The Bigfoot had completely disabled the weapons and left them on our porch as a message. The threat had been neutralized. The weapons that had intimidated us were gone. On the 4th morning, the Bigfoot gathered in the yard. Clearly, they were preparing to leave. Their task was complete. The lead, enormous Bigfoot stepped up to the porch, alongside the injured one. Both placed their massive hands on the ground and gestured toward the forest. I understood. Our property was now protected. Their territory extended to our land. Any threat to us was a threat to them. Dad stood beside me on the porch, watching them for a long moment. Then he did something that surprised me. He stepped down from the porch and approached the Bigfoot. He knelt, placed his hand on the ground as they had, and pointed toward the forest. A silent agreement. An understanding between humans and Bigfoot, between my dad and the tribe. They would protect our land, we would respect theirs. We would share this space not as enemies, but as neighbors. The Bigfoot turned as a group and began moving into the forest. The smaller female looked back several times. I raised my hand in farewell. She made a soft sound in response. The injured Bigfoot paused at the forest's edge, turned fully, and lifted one enormous hand, fingers splayed, holding it there for several seconds. I raised my hand to mirror it. Then it disappeared, slowly fading into the trees. All six vanished into the forest as if they had never been there. The only proof of their presence were the giant footprints in the snow and the shattered rifles on our porch. Life returned to its normal rhythm, but everything was different. Dad never spoke plainly about what had happened. He simply remarked that perhaps some old stories weren't entirely false. Maybe there were things in the forest that people had seen and not lied about. Perhaps neighbors who didn't live nearby could still become part of the community. Things continued to appear at the edge of the forest. Firewood was neatly stacked, food appeared, rabbits and fish were always prepared cleanly. Once, we even found a broken axe repaired with leather cord, looking better than before we left it. Tools weren't needed anymore. Leftover town food, old blankets, tarps. In return, it was a kind of relationship. The livestock were no longer disturbed, no more panic stampedes, no more frightened animals, and the wolves that had hunted in the area suddenly stopped coming near our ranch. Dad often saw wolf tracks leading toward the farm, only to abruptly change direction, as if warned off by something enormous and far more frightening. That February, we were hit by a fierce blizzard, dumping a meter of snow in a single night. Dad and I woke to find a cleared path from the house to the barn, perfectly shoveled. Giant footprints lined the edges. Leftover food had been cleared during the night so we could reach the animals. When spring arrived, I began camping near the edge of the forest. Sometimes I'd set up a small tent and sleep out there, watching the trees. Occasionally, I'd see figures moving far in the woods, tall, upright, watching. The Bigfoot were still there, still keeping watch over the property. During those months, Dad taught me about respect. He often said things like, "Some neighbors don't need to live next door to be part of your community. Some friendships don't require words. Sometimes the best way to honor an agreement is to keep it silent." One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Dad said, "That day you did the right thing." He spoke it plainly. It was the only time he directly acknowledged what I had done in the woods. The only time he openly admitted that I had freed the Bigfoot from the cage. Sitting there, I realized that compassion and courage sometimes mean the same thing. That doing the right thing isn't always safe. That sometimes you have to make a choice while alone, afraid, with no one telling you what to do. Years later, when I inherited the ranch after Dad passed, I maintained the same understanding with the forest. The Bigfoot tribe continued to guard this land. I still leave offerings on the trees. The relationship persists. There are boundaries to respect. There are friendships that require no words or constant contact. Some neighbors may live miles away and still be the most loyal friends you'll ever have. I never saw the injured Bigfoot again, at least not clearly. But sometimes, on winter nights, I catch a tall figure at the edge of the forest, standing watch. Sometimes I find offerings, left in places only that same Bigfoot would remember. This land is shared, not conquered. The forest and the ranch coexist, protected by an agreement between species that most people would never believe exists. But it does. It exists. And as long as someone lives on this ranch and honors that agreement, the Bigfoot tribe will continue to watch from the trees. That is what I learned the winter I was 10. Sometimes the most terrifying things are also the most loyal. Sometimes the greatest risks bring the greatest rewards. And sometimes when you free something from a cage, you free yourself too. For more incredible stories, check them out here.